"They think I don't understand," she said, smiling that glossy social smile women wear when they're performing kindness. Then leaning closer to her friend, she whispered, "Es tan patético." He's so pathetic. She said it with the softness of a compliment, the kind you can only hear if you've spent your whole life learning to read tones, not words. But I heard every syllable. I've been hearing things people think I can't understand since before she was born. It was supposed to be a family dinner, a celebration of my son's engagement, a small gathering to meet the woman he said had changed his life. I remember thinking, as I arranged the napkins and lit the candles, that maybe she had. I just didn't know how completely yet. I'm 72. I live alone now in a small apartment above a bakery that opens before dawn, so the smell of yeast and sugar has become the scent of my mornings. The windows rattle in the wind, and the floor creaks like it's learning to speak again after years of silence. I like it that way. But that night, I was not yet this woman, the one who can sit in her own company without apology. That night, I was still the mother who irons her best blouse twice and spritzes a little perfume behind her ears because her son's fiancée is coming to dinner. The evening had begun like every other family gathering I had ever tried too hard to perfect. I set the table with the good plates, the ones with the faded blue edges that once belonged to my mother. I'd made arroz con pollo, roasted sweet peppers, and a flan that trembled just right when you tilted the plate. My son, David, called an hour before to say they might be late. Sophia had to finish a call, he said, as if that were a sacred reason. When they arrived, she stepped into my apartment as though stepping onto a stage. Everything about her gleamed, her hair, her jewelry, her politeness. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from the old photographs to the embroidered curtains. Not judgmental exactly, just calculating, like a realtor assessing market value. I asked if she wanted wine. "Just a little," she said, and when I poured it, she didn't drink. David followed her every movement with that hopeful nervousness men wear when they're afraid of being found wanting. I wanted to believe it was love. It looked like anxiety dressed up in a suit. Dinner started awkwardly. She complimented the food in that distant tone that people use when they are fulfilling a social duty. She laughed lightly when David spilled a bit of wine on his sleeve, then looked at him with an expression that made my chest tighten. And then came the whisper. "Es tan patético." I don't know if it was meant for her friend across the table or for herself, but it reached me like a secret meant to cut rather than conceal. My son didn't hear. He was too busy apologizing, dabbing at the stain, smiling as if love were something he could prove through effort. I smiled too, out of habit, the way mothers do when they realize that to protect their children, they sometimes must swallow the insult before it burns. I didn't say a word. I simply refilled her glass. In silence, I translated every word she hadn't said. The rest of the evening passed in that brittle, careful rhythm of people pretending to belong to the same world. Sophia talked about her work, her friends, her favorite restaurants in Madrid. I nodded in the right places, asked polite questions, kept my voice gentle. When I told her I'd grown up in Havana before moving to Florida in my 20s, she smiled faintly. "How lovely. I've been to Cuba once, for a resort trip." I asked which part. "Varadero," she said. I said nothing. I wanted to tell her that Varadero isn't Cuba, just as a cruise ship isn't the ocean, but I didn't. I've learned that people who only see paradise in poverty don't want to be corrected. They want to be admired for visiting it. So, I let her talk. I listened. I studied the way she held my son's hand under the table, not with tenderness, but possession. She had the confidence of someone who had never needed to earn her place at any table. I wondered if she could imagine what it's like to be invisible in your own family, to speak in a language that nobody in the room wants to hear. After they left that night, I sat at the table surrounded by empty plates and the faint smell of burnt sugar. The apartment was quiet, except for the clock ticking on the wall. I replayed her words in my head again and again, like a song that refuses to end. He's so pathetic. Maybe she meant it as a joke. Maybe she thought it was harmless. But I saw my son's face, his nervous smile, his constant need for her approval, and I knew there was truth in her tone. It wasn't love she offered him. It was elevation, the illusion of rescue from a life too ordinary. And I, his mother, represented everything ordinary he was trying to escape. That's what hurt most. Not her arrogance, but his eagerness to let it define him. I went to wash the dishes, but my hands shook. The soap bubbles broke against my knuckles, and I thought about all the dinners I'd cooked for David, when it was just the two of us, after his father left, after the late shifts at the clinic, after the small victories of paying another bill on time. I'd made those same recipes then, too, the arroz with extra saffron when he was sad, the flan when he passed an exam. Every meal was a language, one that didn't need translation. And now, here was this woman mocking him in the tongue I'd given him, the one he'd forgotten after middle school because he said it made him sound too ethnic. I had taught him to be proud of where he came from, but somewhere between growing up and getting polished, he'd learned to hide it. I don't blame him entirely. The world rewards those who can blend. Still, hearing his fiancée use my mother's language as a weapon against him felt like watching someone use my own heartbeat to wound my child. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake, listening to the refrigerator hum, the city breathing outside my window. I thought of calling him, asking if he'd heard what she said, if he understood what kind of woman he'd brought into his life. But I didn't. What could I say? Your fiancé thinks you're pathetic, and she said it in the language you abandoned. He'd defend her. He'd tell me I misunderstood. That's what sons do when they love someone who doesn't love them back the same way. They protect the wrong person. So I stayed silent. I've spent years learning that silence can be both shield and prison, and I wasn't sure yet which one I was building. The next morning, I found a note from David on my phone. "Thanks for dinner, Mom. Sophia loved it. She said you remind her of her grandmother. Hope you didn't feel uncomfortable with all the Spanish." I stared at that message until my coffee went cold. She'd told him she spoke Spanish, to make me feel included. The lie was neat, almost elegant. I typed and deleted 3 different replies. In the end, I just wrote, "You both looked happy. That's what matters." But it wasn't happiness I'd seen in his eyes. It was submission, the quiet panic of someone afraid to lose affection. I recognized it because I'd lived it too long, in another marriage, another life. That evening, as the sun set through the narrow window above my sink, I took out the old dictionary I'd used when David was a child. Spanish to English, the pages thin as onion skin, corners frayed from years of use. I hadn't opened it in a decade. I ran my hand over the cover, and the smell of old paper rose like a ghost. I used to read it to him at bedtime, one new word a night. Amor, corazón, esperanza, love, heart, hope. I used to believe that if he knew those words, really knew them, he'd grow into a man who understood their meaning. Somewhere along the line, he'd stopped needing translations, but maybe he'd also stopped understanding. I whispered to the empty room. He's not pathetic, Sophia. He's kind. He's soft. And you don't deserve to speak about him in my tongue. The words echoed back to me, and for the first time in years, I felt something stirring. Not anger exactly, but a quiet, precise resolve, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits for the right moment to reveal what's been learned in silence. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, and I realized that every insult, every slight, every whispered dismissal had been a translation exercise of its own. People underestimate women like me because they assume age dulls understanding, that accents are proof of ignorance, that politeness means weakness. But language is memory, and mine is long. I cleaned the table, turned off the lights, and sat by the window watching the bakery below prepare for morning. Somewhere between the hum of the mixers and the clatter of trays, I decided that next time she tried to speak in a language she thought I didn't know, I would let her hear what fluency sounds like when spoken with dignity. It took me 72 years to stop apologizing for existing in the wrong language, the wrong skin, the wrong generation. But I'm done apologizing. They think they're fluent in everything that matters. Money, manners, appearances. I'm fluent in survival, in listening, in the quiet art of remembering. And when the time comes, I'll speak clearly enough that even the ones pretending not to understand will have no choice but to hear. The real fracture began the following Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that looked harmless from the outside. Sunlight slanting through half-closed blinds, the smell of coffee lingering after lunch, a soft radio hum in the kitchen. David and Sophia had invited me to their new apartment for a planning session, which in their language meant a meeting where my presence would be tolerated but not required. I'd baked a cake, the same one David always asked for on his birthdays, a dense almond sponge with a whisper of orange zest. I wrapped it carefully, tied it with ribbon, and carried it on the bus, balancing it on my lap like something fragile that might break if looked at too hard. The bus driver asked where I was headed, and I said, "My son's." The words came out smaller than I expected. Their apartment sat in one of those new buildings that look like they've been scrubbed of personality before anyone even moves in. White walls, sharp corners, no smell of life. When I rang the bell, Sophia opened the door wearing soft beige tones that made her look like part of the furniture. Her smile was instant and mechanical. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said. I said, "It's tradition," and handed her the cake. She looked at it like she was assessing its caloric content, then thanked me without meaning it and set it aside. David came out from the hallway, shirt tucked, hair neatly combed, and hugged me quickly, his body stiff, like he was afraid to wrinkle his composure. "You made it," he said, as though there had been a chance I wouldn't. "Of course I did," I said. "You asked." We sat at their dining table, a glossy slab of marble, cold to the touch. Sophia had arranged a spread of cheese cubes, olives, and something labeled artisanal crackers. Everything about the room was deliberate. The perfectly aligned frames, the neutral tones, the absence of warmth. She spoke first, her tone bright and falsely inclusive. "So we're finalizing the guest list today. We thought it'd be nice if you helped with the family side." I nodded, relieved to be included in some small way. I reached for the pen lying next to a neatly typed list. My eyes scanned the columns. Names from her family, her friends, her colleagues. When I reached the section labeled Family Groom, I froze. There was my name, one line down from David's mother, Mary Cross. In parentheses beside it, a single word. Spain? I blinked, unsure if it was a note, a joke, or an insult. Spain? I asked quietly. I'm Cuban, not Spanish. Sophia's cheeks lifted in a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I just thought it sounded more elegant for the invitations. You know, heritage flair. David didn't look up. He was busy scrolling through something on his phone. I said, My heritage doesn't need flair. It has history. She laughed lightly, as if I'd told a charming joke, and changed the subject. It was such a small moment, but something inside me cracked, a soundless, invisible split. I realized that this woman wasn't simply thoughtless. She was deliberate in her erasure. The conversation drifted toward finances, venue deposits, flower arrangements, photography packages. I listened, uninvited, while they spoke in the tone of people who believe they're building an empire. When the topic of costs came up, David glanced at me for the first time. Mom, he said, almost hesitant, you still have that savings account from Dad, right? The one you've been keeping for emergencies? I nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. It's just, we're trying to keep the wedding within budget, but Sophia found this incredible venue, and, well, it's a bit higher than we planned. I was wondering if you could help cover the deposit. We'd pay you back after the honeymoon. For a long moment, I didn't answer. The light from the window fell across the marble, bright and sterile. I thought of all the times I'd said yes without hesitation, the times I'd given him money for college, for his first car, for the down payment on the condo he sold after his first breakup. I remembered telling myself that's what mothers do. They fill the gaps their children pretend aren't there. But now, sitting across from a woman who couldn't say my name without reshaping it into something palatable, I felt the word yes catch in my throat. I looked at Sophia. She was watching me, her smile sharpened with expectation, as if my generosity were another test she was sure I would pass. How much is the deposit? I asked, already knowing I'd say yes, because old habits die slow. 10,000, David said. I felt the number like a pulse in my wrist. Of course, I said. I'll help. Sophia clapped her hands softly, a gesture of triumph disguised as gratitude. You're such a blessing, she said. Family is everything, isn't it? I nodded, though I wasn't sure what she meant by family. After the planning, they offered me coffee. I followed Sophia into the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of lemon and something synthetic. She moved with efficient grace, every gesture rehearsed. You really didn't have to do that, she said, her tone syrupy. David would never have asked if it weren't important. I smiled tightly. He didn't ask. You did. She froze for a fraction of a second, then resumed stirring her coffee. I just want what's best for him, she said. He's had struggles. She said the word like it was contagious. He's always been so sensitive, so easily overwhelmed, but he's improving. I'm helping him. I looked at her then, really looked. You think sensitivity is something to cure? She tilted her head. It's not ideal in a man, don't you think? I took a slow breath. No, I don't think. We stood there in a silence that stretched too long to be polite. Then she smiled again, bright and false. Anyway, he's lucky to have both of us taking care of him. I didn't answer. I left my cup untouched on the counter and returned to the table where David sat, reviewing spreadsheets of expenses. completely unaware of the quiet war taking place in the next room. I looked at my son, the way his shoulders slumped, the way he laughed a half-second late at her jokes, the way his fingers kept tracing the rim of his glass. He looked tired in a way youth shouldn't. When it was time to leave, I hugged him goodbye, and for a moment I thought I felt him press back, but it might have been my imagination. Sophia walked me to the door, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "You're such a lovely woman," she said, and then added, with that same sugar-coated cruelty, "I hope I age as gracefully as you." The words were meant to sound kind, but underneath them lay the unspoken. "You're already fading." I smiled, kissed her cheek, and said, "Time treats people according to how they treat others." Her smile faltered for just a moment. Then I stepped into the hallway. The elevator ride down felt endless. I held the railing, breathing in the sterile air, and for the first time in years, I wished I smoked. Outside, the street smelled of exhaust and rain. I stood for a while before calling a cab, watching people hurry past, their faces turned toward their own small futures. I thought about how many years I had spent building a foundation for David, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, only to watch someone else decorate it in marble and call it hers. That night, I took the envelope from my dresser, the one with my savings documents, and held it under the lamp. $10,000. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was what it represented. Another quiet extraction of love repackaged as duty. I thought about saying no, about teaching him that love isn't measured in transactions, that adulthood means learning to stand without leaning on the people who taught you to walk. But then I remembered his voice at 10 years old, whispering through tears after his first school play. "Did I do okay, Mama?" He'd been so afraid of failing, so desperate to be enough. And maybe that's what I'd done to him, taught him that love comes easiest when it's earned. That night, I wrote the check anyway, but when I sealed the envelope, I didn't mail it. I placed it on the counter and stared at it until dawn. Something had shifted inside me. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. I realized I was standing at the intersection between who I'd always been and who I might still become. Sophia's whisper, that small, poisoned phrase, "He's so pathetic," had lodged itself in my bones, not because of its cruelty, but because of its accuracy in her eyes. To her, both of us were pathetic. A man too eager to please, and a mother too willing to give. I understood then that this wasn't just her insult. It was the mirror she was holding up to show me what I had become. The next morning, I dressed deliberately. Ironed blouse, hair pinned neatly, the small gold earrings David had given me years ago. I took the check, slipped it into my purse, and walked out into the morning light. But instead of heading toward the post office, I turned the other way. I didn't know where I was going yet. I only knew I was done funding the illusion that gratitude would ever come from people who saw kindness as weakness. I walked for hours, past storefronts and cafes, past a park where children chased pigeons and a man played guitar under a maple tree. The city felt wide again, full of air and possibility. I sat on a bench and looked at the check, the ink already dry, the amount written clearly. Then slowly, I tore it down the middle. The paper made a soft sound, like breath. It was the smallest rebellion I'd ever made, but it felt like oxygen. I didn't know then that this was the beginning, the moment I stopped translating myself for people who didn't want to understand. After that Sunday, things didn't explode. They eroded. That's how cruelty usually works when it's dressed in civility. It seeps into the walls, into the air, until even silence feels contaminated. I saw David and Sophia often enough that month to notice the pattern. She began calling me Mary instead of Mom, though she never asked if that was what I preferred. She said it the way you say a word you don't plan to use often, light and dismissive, a sound meant to take up as little space as possible. Mary, can you pass the salt? Mary, what do you think of the color scheme? It wasn't what she said, but how the words landed, as if she were testing how far I'd let her rewrite me. I let her, at first. I told myself names were just labels, that it didn't matter. But each time she said it, I felt something in me shrink, the way fabric does when it's washed too often in hot water. David didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to. He'd begun talking about work constantly, about his new position at the firm, about his boss, about the late nights that made him feel important. I'd listen and nod, though sometimes his voice sounded like an echo of someone else's ambition. One evening, I came over for dinner, and Sophia had rearranged the living room. The bookshelf that used to hold David's old photo albums now displayed framed certificates and travel guides. The photos were gone. "Where are the albums?" I asked. "Oh, I packed them away," she said easily, slicing limes for cocktails. "We'll digitize everything later. Physical clutter makes a home feel dated." I wanted to tell her that clutter is what makes a house alive, that a fingerprint on glass or a crooked frame means someone has lived and felt there. But I didn't. I just nodded and sat down. Dinner that night was a tableau of quiet disapproval. She served quinoa salad and broiled salmon, arranging everything with surgical precision. She poured wine into delicate glasses that looked too thin to hold any warmth. "I hope this is okay," she said sweetly. "I know you prefer heavier food, but we're trying to eat clean." I told her it looked wonderful. It wasn't the food I missed. It was the conversation that used to accompany it. David spoke less and less when we were all together, as if every word risked offending someone. When I asked him about his latest project, Sophia interrupted, offering to explain it for him, turning his accomplishments into anecdotes about how she'd encouraged or advised him. He smiled like that was normal. I watched his hand move to hers across the table, and she let it rest there for only a moment before pulling away to reach for her wine. The small humiliations continued, always couched in politeness. Once, when they had guests over, a couple from Sophia's firm, I was invited to make it feel more family-like. I wore a simple navy dress, the one David always said brought out my eyes. As I walked into their apartment, I heard Sophia whisper something in Spanish to her friend. "Mira, parece una profesora jubilada. She looks like a retired teacher." Her friend laughed softly. I didn't flinch. I could have said something, reminded them that I understood every word. But instead I smiled, kissed David on the cheek, and said hello as if I hadn't heard. That's the thing about surviving long enough. You learn that some dignity isn't in answering. It's in waiting for the right moment to speak, so that silence itself becomes your witness. After that dinner, I started noticing how carefully I modulated myself around them. I laughed less, spoke softly, never corrected her, even when she mispronounced my mother's name during a toast. "To Elena," she said, making it sound like Helena, European and elegant, stripping it of its rhythm. I swallowed the correction with my wine. Later that night, as I rode home, I looked out at the passing lights and realized that I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Smaller, quieter, a shadow haunting the edges of her own life. The worst part wasn't her disdain. It was my compliance. One afternoon, David called to say they'd like me to come over and help sort through family items. When I arrived, there were 3 boxes stacked neatly in the living room. Things I'd given him over the years. Old photographs, ceramic dishes, the quilt I'd made when he went to college. "We're just trying to simplify," he said. "Sophia's idea, but I agree. Less is more, right?" I touched the quilt, the one stitched from scraps of his childhood clothes, the faded dinosaur print from his pajamas, the patch from his first baseball uniform. The fabric had softened with time, like memories that refused to harden. "Of course," I said, folding it carefully, though inside my hands trembled. Sophia smiled and said, "We thought you might like to keep these things. They have sentimental value, and you're better at that sort of thing." She waved vaguely, as if sentiment were an outdated hobby. I carried the boxes home on the bus, each one heavier than its weight. I placed them in my apartment, stacked by the window, and sat staring at them for a long time. The city outside moved in its own rhythm, cars passing, people talking, but inside, everything felt still. I opened one box and pulled out a photograph of David at 12, covered in flour, grinning beside a lopsided cake we'd baked for his father's birthday. I remembered the smell of sugar and smoke, the way he'd licked the spoon and declared himself a chef. Now, that boy lived behind glass and polite conversations. I wondered if Sophia ever saw him, or if she only saw the polished man she was trying to shape. Weeks passed, and my visits became less frequent. I told myself it was because they were busy, because young couples need space, but the truth was simpler. I was tired of being erased politely. Each time I left their apartment, I felt like I'd been gently sanded down, my edges dulled. Even my language began to fracture. When I spoke Spanish to David, just small phrases, "¿Tienes hambre?" or "¿Cómo estás, mi hijo?" He answered in English, embarrassed, glancing toward Sophia as though my words might stain him. Once when I forgot myself and said, "Te quiero," he laughed awkwardly and said, "Love you too, Mom," as if translation were an apology. It was after one of those visits that I realized what was truly happening. They weren't simply pushing me to the margins. They were rewriting the story altogether. In conversations with her friends, Sophia referred to David as self-made, as though he'd grown from the soil fully formed, untouched by the years I spent holding everything together. She told people his humble beginnings made him resilient. I heard it once when I stopped by unannounced and found her chatting on the phone, unaware I was in the doorway. "He had a tough childhood," she said. "His mother was, well, she did her best." Her tone carried the same softness as her insults, sugar over arsenic. I went home that evening and sat by the window with a cup of tea, though it grew cold before I touched it. Outside, the sky was the color of bruised fruit, heavy and low. I thought of all the years I'd spent making sure David would never feel ashamed of his roots, teaching him to speak properly, dress neatly, study hard, arming him against a world that wouldn't forgive his softness or his accent. And now, standing tall beside a woman who mistook cruelty for sophistication, he seemed ashamed anyway. The irony was unbearable. I tried talking to him once more. I called late one night, after I'd seen a photo of them online, her Instagram, public for all to admire. The caption read, "Building the life we deserve." He stood beside her, smiling, but there was something off in his expression, a stiffness around the mouth, the eyes unfocused. When he answered the phone, his voice was tired. "Hey, Mom," he said. I asked how he was. He said fine. I mentioned that I'd seen the photo and that he looked handsome. There was a pause before he said, "Sophia's been helping me dress better." Then, quietly, "She says presentation matters." I wanted to tell him that love shouldn't be an improvement plan, that being loved shouldn't mean being remade. But instead, I just said, "I hope she sees you the way I do." He didn't answer right away. "She's different," he said. "She challenges me." I almost laughed. Challenges are supposed to make you grow, not disappear. He sighed. "Mom, please don't start." I didn't. We hung up and I sat in the dark, realizing that my son was drifting somewhere I couldn't follow. By then, I had stopped cooking for them. The last time I'd brought food, Sophia had smiled and said, "Oh, that's sweet, but we don't really eat carbs anymore." As if affection itself had a nutritional value. So I stopped offering. Instead, I began cooking for myself again, reclaiming recipes I hadn't touched in years. The kitchen filled with the smells of garlic and cumin, onions caramelizing in olive oil, rice simmering until the air turned heavy with comfort. I'd eat alone, sometimes standing by the stove, spoon in hand, and feel something ancient stir. A reminder that feeding myself was not an act of loneliness, but of survival. Still, the ache lingered. There's a particular pain in realizing that the people you love see you as a relic, a reminder of a life they've outgrown. I told myself I'd confront it one day, that I'd choose the right words and the right moment. But the truth is, confrontation requires an audience willing to listen, and mine was already gone. So I stayed quiet, but not asleep. I watched, I remembered, and somewhere deep inside, a part of me began rehearsing what it would sound like when I finally spoke. Not as a mother begging to be heard, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. It hadn't happened yet, but it was coming. The slow gathering of a storm that begins with nothing more than a whisper. Enough. It was the middle of summer when the turning point arrived, quiet and almost unremarkable from the outside, but monumental within. The air that day was heavy with heat, thick enough to make breathing feel like a decision. I had been invited, or perhaps summoned, to another of their small gatherings, a pre-wedding dinner for close family only. The invitation arrived by text from David, formal and oddly rehearsed. "Sophia and I would love to have you join us this Saturday, 7 p.m. Just casual. Casual, I later discovered, meant coordinated outfits and a hired photographer to capture the candid laughter of people pretending they weren't uncomfortable. I ironed my light blue dress, pinned my hair up, and told myself that this time I would not let her silence me. I didn't know yet what form that defiance would take, only that it had begun to grow somewhere beneath my ribs like a small, steady flame. When I arrived, the table was already set, each place marked by a folded card with names written in gold ink. Mine read, Mary. The others had full names, first and last, elegant in their symmetry. I turned the card over as if inspecting it for something hidden, then placed it face down. Sophia's voice came from behind me, sweet and sharp. "Oh, do you not like how it's written?" I smiled without turning around. "I just prefer not to label myself tonight." For a moment she didn't respond. Then she laughed lightly, the sound of glass tapping against glass. "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable." Comfort, for her, was a script she performed fluently. Dinner was held on their terrace, the one she'd filled with potted olive trees that had never touched soil. The evening light stretched long shadows across the table. David sat at the head, his posture deliberate, his smile just slightly too bright. There were 10 of us, her parents, her brother, and his girlfriend, 2 colleagues from her firm, and one old friend of David's who looked as uneasy as I felt. I watched Sophia glide between guests, pouring wine, correcting the waiter's pronunciation of the entree, offering compliments that landed like subtle commands. She had that rare gift of making everyone feel seen and inferior at the same time. I remember thinking she was a woman who needed control, the way other people need oxygen. As the meal went on, the conversation turned to wedding preparations. Sophia's mother, a thin woman with an accent polished by private schools, asked if there would be any traditional elements in the ceremony. "Oh, yes," Sophia said brightly, "but not too traditional. We want something modern, clean, nothing too sentimental." Her gaze slid toward me as she said it, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I lifted my glass and said, "I always thought sentiment was what made things worth remembering." The air around the table stilled for a heartbeat, then softened with polite laughter. David looked at me, uncertain, as though waiting to see if Sophia would decide whether my comment had been acceptable. She smiled, teeth white, eyes cool. "Of course, that's true for some people," she said, and the conversation moved on. Later, when dessert arrived, she brought out a small cake with white icing and silver decorations, flawless and lifeless, the kind that looked better in photos than on the tongue. I watched her cut it into even slices and serve them carefully. When she placed mine in front of me, she said, "I know you prefer homemade, but we're a bit short on time these days. Everything's so busy." Her tone was soft, but her eyes were firm. I realized then that she wasn't apologizing. She was declaring victory. She had replaced the flan, the arroz, the hand-rolled tamales, all the flavors of my history, with something that came from a boutique bakery that didn't even smell like sugar. I thanked her politely, lifted my fork, and tasted nothing. After the guests left, I stayed behind to help clean, though she insisted it wasn't necessary. "You should relax," she said. "We've got a cleaning service coming in the morning." I picked up the plates anyway, moving deliberately, each motion grounding me in the body she wanted to make invisible. David disappeared into the office to take a call, and for a brief moment, it was just the two of us. The city buzzed softly outside, the lights painting long lines across the floor. She leaned against the counter, watching me. "You know," she began, "I think David really worries about you. He says you get lonely sometimes." I didn't look at her. "He worries more than he needs to. I've been alone before. It's not as tragic as people imagine." She tilted her head, studying me. "Still, it must be hard. Seeing him build a life that doesn't include you as much. Change can be difficult at your age." The words were smooth, unflinching, delivered with the care of someone who knows exactly where to cut. I turned, finally meeting her eyes. "You'd be surprised what I can still change when I decide to." She smiled, but her gaze flickered just slightly. That flicker was enough to steady me. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood by the window, the city glowing faintly below, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like summer rain, metallic and sharp. I poured a glass of wine and sat down at the kitchen table. For the first time in a long while, I let myself think about what it meant to be invisible. Not the kind of invisibility that comes with age, but the kind that's imposed by someone else's comfort, the kind that demands your silence as proof of your decency. I thought about my mother and the way she used to say that women like us had to learn to live in two languages, the one the world gave us and the one we built in secret. Somewhere between those two, I realized, I had lost myself. The next morning, I woke early and began pulling boxes from the closet, the ones filled with old letters, photos, and recipes. Dust rose like smoke as I opened them. I sat cross-legged on the floor and started sorting. There were letters from David's father, faded postcards from friends long gone, recipes written in my mother's looping script. I ran my fingers over the paper, tracing the indentations of her handwriting as if it could transfer strength. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from the bread I'd baked the day before. As the sun rose higher, the light warmed the room, softening its edges. That was when I found the small leather notebook I hadn't seen in years, my old Spanish-English diary from when I first came to the United States. I opened it and read the first entry, written in uneven ink. Today, I spoke to someone in English and didn't cry after. I smiled. It felt like meeting the younger version of myself, the woman who believed that learning another language would save her. That afternoon, I carried the notebook with me to the park. Children were playing near the fountain, their laughter cutting through the air like music. I sat on a bench and began to write again, slowly, in Spanish first, then translating each line into English beneath it. The act itself felt like breathing after holding my breath too long. I wrote about the dinner, about Sophia's calculated grace, about the way my son's laughter now sounded like an apology. I wrote without censoring myself, without translating my emotions to make them palatable. The words flowed, sometimes clumsy, sometimes sharp, but always mine. When I returned home, I placed the notebook on the kitchen table next to my mother's old dictionary. For the first time, those two objects didn't feel like remnants of a past life. They felt like tools for a new one. I made myself a cup of tea, squeezed lemon into it, and turned on the small radio by the sink. A Spanish song came through the static, one I hadn't heard in decades. I started humming along, softly at first, then louder until my voice filled the kitchen. I sang off key, I forgot some words, but it didn't matter. It was the sound of reclamation. That night, when David called, his voice was full of routine concern. "Hey, Mom. Sophia said you looked a little tired at dinner. Everything okay?" I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, the way she filtered my existence through her interpretations. "I'm fine," I said. "Just rediscovering some old things." He chuckled awkwardly. "You mean like antiques?" "Something like that," I said. "Except the thing I'm rediscovering isn't for sale." He didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain. We talked about trivialities, the weather, his workload, but beneath the conversation, I felt something shift. I wasn't waiting for his approval anymore. When the call ended, I went to the window again. The night air was cooler now, brushing against my face with the faint scent of jasmine. I thought of Sophia's smirk, her careful control, her assumption that my silence was submission. I realized she'd made a mistake common to those who've never had to fight to be heard. She mistook endurance for weakness. But endurance is where strength lives quietly, waiting. That night, as the city exhaled around me, I made a decision. Not a loud one, not yet, but solid as stone. I would no longer translate myself into the version that made others comfortable. The next time she spoke in my language, she would not find silence staring back. It began, as most awakenings do, not with rage, but with clarity. I understood now that power doesn't come from being heard. It comes from knowing when to speak and when to let the echo of your truth do the rest. I sat down at the table, opened my notebook again, and wrote a single line in both languages, side by side, like a mirror. La próxima vez, no me quedaré callada. The next time, I won't stay silent. It happened almost by accident, though I've come to believe that accidents are just the universe's way of pushing us where we're too frightened to go. The weeks after that dinner blurred into a haze of polite distance and occasional calls from David that felt more like check-ins than conversations. Each time his number appeared on my phone, I braced myself, wondering which version of him would speak, the careful, edited man Sophia had crafted, or the boy I once knew who laughed too loudly and always said too much. More and more, it was the first one who answered. I could hear it in his tone, clipped and professional. A man who'd learned to treat affection like a performance review. I listened, nodded into the silence, and when he hung up, I returned to the quiet rhythm of my days, baking, reading, writing in my notebook. It was during one of those mornings, the kind that feels suspended between peace and waiting, that I received the email. It came from Sophia. The subject line was practical. Rehearsal, dinner, logistics. I clicked, expecting the usual details about times, addresses, dress codes. What I found instead was a neatly written message that began with, "Dear Mary, I hope this note finds you well." My stomach tightened. I'd come to recognize that tone, the polite cruelty wrapped in grammar. She went on to say that the dinner would be a streamlined event, and that due to spatial limitations, they'd had to make difficult decisions about the guest list. My name, she said, would not appear on the formal seating plan, but of course, I was welcome to stop by briefly after dinner to greet everyone. She added a smiley face at the end, a digital wink that made the insult feel more deliberate. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. I reread it, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood, that there must be a mistake. But there it was, plain as daylight. She was uninviting me from my own son's rehearsal dinner, offering instead a role like an afterthought, a cameo appearance in a life I had built from scratch. I sat there for a long time, hands folded in my lap, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. There was an old superstition my mother used to whisper when she felt wronged. Cuando te quieren borrar, escribe más fuerte. When they try to erase you, write louder. I thought of that then, the words rising in my memory like a warning and a promise. I didn't cry. I had done enough of that in other lives, in other kitchens. Instead, I printed the email, folded it neatly, and placed it under my notebook on the table. I decided I wouldn't respond. Not yet. Silence, I'd learned, was the most eloquent language when used intentionally. 2 days later, David called. "Mom, hey," he said, his voice hesitant. "You got Sophia's email, right? She just wanted to make sure everything was clear." I wanted to ask if he'd read it, if he'd noticed how she'd written to me like a stranger. But I only said, "I got it." There was a pause. "You're not upset, are you?" he asked. I could hear him trying to sound casual, the way people do when they already know the answer. "It's just, the space is small, and we wanted to keep it intimate." I almost laughed. "Intimate," I repeated softly. "Yes, that's one word for it." He hesitated again, then said, "She didn't mean anything by it, Mom. You know how she gets about details." "I do," I said. "She's very precise." He exhaled audibly, relieved by what he thought was agreement. "You'll still come afterward, right?" "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." After the call, I sat at my table and wrote in my notebook for nearly an hour. I wrote about erasure, about how women like Sophia don't destroy. They edit. They trim edges, correct tones, choose which parts of you belong in their narrative. And I wrote about my son, how he had learned to live inside her revisions, mistaking her control for love. The words flowed easily, almost feverishly, as if something inside me had been waiting to be named. When I was done, I felt lighter, but also sharper, like glass that's been cleaned of dust. The night of the rehearsal dinner arrived with rain, the kind that starts as a drizzle and turns into a curtain. I dressed slowly, choosing a soft gray dress that had once been my favorite, but had since been relegated to the back of the closet. I pinned my hair, added my mother's pearl earrings, and wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. Before leaving, I glanced at the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked calm, but beneath that calm, there was something else, an alertness, a readiness. I slipped the printed email into my purse without knowing why, only that it felt right to bring it with me. The restaurant was in the city center, one of those places that called itself rustic, while charging more than a week's wages for simplicity. Through the glass, I could see the long table, the flicker of candles, the sheen of wine glasses catching light. Everyone was already seated. I recognized Sophia's posture instantly, straight-backed, commanding without seeming so. David sat beside her, smiling in that careful, obedient way that made my chest ache. I waited outside until the rain eased, then walked in. A young hostess greeted me, asking for my name. When I told her, she glanced at the tablet in her hand, confusion flickering across her face. "Oh, I don't see a reservation for that name." I smiled. "That's all right. I'm not on the list. I'm family." Her discomfort deepened, but before she could respond, a man approached. It was one of Sophia's colleagues. "Oh, you must be David's mother," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Come in, please." He guided me to the edge of the table, where conversations paused like a record scratching. Sophia's face didn't change, but her eyes did. A quick flash of irritation, gone as soon as it appeared. "Mary," she said, her voice sugar-dipped, "you made it! How lovely!" I looked around. The table was full. "I hope I'm not interrupting?" "Not at all," she said, gesturing vaguely to a side chair near the end. "We weren't sure you'd come, so we didn't. Well, there's limited seating, but please make yourself comfortable." I sat down. David looked uncomfortable, though he tried to hide it. "You look nice, Mom," he said quietly. "Thanks, sweetheart," I replied. "You do too." The dinner continued, the conversation flowing around me like a current I wasn't meant to enter. They spoke about investments, travel plans, renovation projects. When they mentioned the wedding venue, someone asked about the food. "We're keeping it elegant but familiar," Sophia explained. "No heavy flavors, nothing too ethnic." The word hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I saw David's jaw tighten, but he said nothing. I took a sip of water and said, "Sometimes heavy flavors carry the heart." She smiled, that same perfect smile. "Of course, but weddings are about lightness. We want everything to feel fresh, clean." I nodded slowly. Yes, clean. The rain began again outside, tapping against the windows like fingers. After dessert, people stood to mingle, to take photos. Sophia posed with her friends, her laughter bright and practiced. I stayed seated, watching. There was something strangely cinematic about the scene. The flawless woman in the perfect dress, the attentive fiancé, the approving guests. It might have been beautiful if it hadn't felt so hollow. I reached into my purse, felt the folded paper of her email between my fingers, and smiled faintly. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done. When it was finally over, I stood, thanked the guests, and approached David. Can we talk outside for a moment? I asked. He nodded, looking wary. The night air was damp, the rain light now misting against our faces. David, I said softly, I want you to know that I love you. Always have, always will. But love isn't blind. It's seeing clearly and choosing anyway. And tonight, I saw clearly. He frowned, confused. Mom, please, not tonight. Sophia's... I know, I interrupted gently. She's everything you think you need right now, but she's not everything you are. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. She's trying, Mom. You just don't understand her. I smiled. Oh, I understand her perfectly. That's what worries me. He didn't reply. Inside, through the glass, I could see Sophia watching us, her expression unreadable. For the first time, I held her gaze without looking away. Something passed between us, not hostility, not yet, but recognition. She knew that I'd stopped being manageable. When David went back inside, I stayed on the sidewalk for a long time, the rain soaking into my shawl. Cars passed, headlights reflecting off the wet pavement, and I felt an unexpected calm. I realized that everything that had happened, the whispers, the exclusions, the careful humiliations, had been building toward this exact stillness, the moment before change. The next morning, I woke to another message from her. Thank you for coming last night, it read. I hope you didn't feel out of place. I stared at it, then deleted it without responding. Instead, I opened my notebook and began writing again, this time not about pain, but about transformation. I wrote that silence is a form of waiting, but waiting is not surrender. I wrote that even a mother can be reborn after years of being told she exists only in the margins. I wrote until my hand cramped and the page filled with ink. When I finished, I read the last sentence aloud to the empty room. She took my son's voice, but she will not take mine. That week, the wedding preparations intensified. I was asked to attend fittings, tastings, rehearsals, each one carefully orchestrated to minimize my presence. Sophia's control was absolute, but something in her rhythm had changed. She was tense, watching me more closely, as if she could sense the quiet rebellion gathering behind my polite smile. Every time she spoke in Spanish, thinking it gave her power, I listened and remembered. Every small slight became another piece of evidence, another line in the story I was no longer afraid to tell. By the time the wedding week arrived, I was no longer the woman who walked on eggshells. I was composed, deliberate, a storm disguised as still water. Sophia, I think, felt it too. She became sharper, more defensive, her smiles brittle, her laughter a fraction too loud. David noticed the tension but couldn't name it. He moved between us like a diplomat trying to prevent a war he didn't understand had already begun. And beneath it all, I waited. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the moment when truth would finally be allowed to speak in its own tongue, unashamed and uninvited, the way all truth eventually does. The wedding day unfolded with the choreographed precision Sophia loved so much, every moment timed, every gesture rehearsed, as if spontaneity itself had been blacklisted from the event. The venue was one of those glass and stone spaces overlooking the water, the kind that looks like money even from a distance. All clean lines and pale flowers and soft music that sounds expensive without being memorable. I arrived early, as instructed, wearing the dress she had approved, a deep blue that she'd described as tasteful and understated, very appropriate. I had ignored her suggestion of a beige shawl, and instead wore the one my mother embroidered by hand, a quiet rebellion draped over my shoulders. In the mirror, the stitches looked like a language of their own, delicate but unarousable. I watched people move around me, the photographers adjusting their lenses, the florist re-fluffing centerpieces, the planner checking lists, and I felt strangely separate, like an actor who has read ahead in the script and is only waiting for her line. David came to find me before the ceremony, and for a moment, when I saw him in his suit, taller than I remember from every memory that still insists on him being smaller, my throat closed. He looked beautiful and tired, the two things rarely meant to live in the same face. "Mom," he said, and pulled me into a quick hug that smelled faintly of cologne and nerves. "Thank you for being here." I held him for a heartbeat longer than he allowed, then let go. "Where else would I be?" I said, and for the first time I wasn't sure. The ceremony itself was flawless, in the way hotel lobbies are flawless. They had written their own vows, hers, fluid and polished, full of words like partnership and elevate. His, shakier, sincere beneath a layer of self-consciousness. When he promised to be the man she believed he could become, something inside my chest twisted. A vow to become is always a quiet confession that who you are has been deemed insufficient. I watched his fingers tremble as he slipped the ring onto her hand, watched her raise their joined hands like a trophy for the guests to applaud. People dabbed at their eyes, not because they saw love, but because they saw a performance that matched their expectations. I didn't cry. My eyes stayed dry and oddly sharp, catching details no one else would remember. The way she corrected the officiant's pronunciation of her name, but didn't bother to correct his of mine. The way David's shoulders dropped in visible relief when the applause started, as if surviving his own wedding was an achievement. Afterward, as people streamed toward the reception hall, Sophia posed for photos with her parents, with her friends, with colleagues, with children holding baskets of petals. When it was time for the family photo, I stepped forward automatically, as one does after a lifetime of assuming that word still included you. The photographer hesitated, glanced at Sophia, and she gave a quick, tight little smile and said, "Let's do one with the parents first. Just us, and then one with everyone." I stopped where I was, the hem of my dress grazing the polished floor, and watched as they arranged themselves. Her in the center, David at her side, her parents flanking them, a perfect symmetry of approval. "Okay," the photographer finally called, "let's bring Mom in now," and I moved into the frame. The shutter clicked twice. In one picture, I am standing beside my son. In the other, I am already leaving. The reception was held in a high-ceilinged hall with tall windows that made the room feel like an aquarium of well-dressed fish. Candles flickered in glass cylinders. The flowers were pale and intentional, and a string quartet played songs no one really listened to. I found my place card near the end of one of the long tables. Mary. Not mother of the groom. Not anything that tethered me to the story being celebrated. Just Mary, floating alone. Around me, conversations hummed, all about markets, promotions, travel, stories polished for public consumption. The food arrived in artfully small portions, each plate a composition. It tasted fine, and of nothing. During the speeches, her father spoke about excellence, about how proud they were to welcome David into a family that values achievement. Her maid of honor spoke about how Sophia inspires everyone around her to level up. Then it was David's turn, and he thanked her for believing in him, for seeing potential others overlooked, for pushing him to be better. Each sentence, meant as gratitude, sounded like confession. I felt every word, not as an accusation, but as confirmation that somewhere along the way, he had rewritten our history in her grammar. When they called me up, it wasn't to make a speech. It was for the mother-son dance. We stood together on the dance floor, and the music shifted to something soft and predictable. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and for a moment it was just us, as it had been for so many years against the world. "You okay?" he murmured. "It's a lot, I know." I looked at his face, at the lines that hadn't been there before, and said, "I'm watching, that's all." He swallowed. "Don't let her get to you," he said too quickly. "She's just intense." It was a small crack, but it was there. "I understand her," I said. "I'm waiting to see if you do." Before he could answer, the song ended, the room applauded, and we stepped apart. They moved into their own dance, the spotlight catching them in a halo of curated romance. She whispered something in his ear. He laughed on command. People sighed, glasses clinked. The night went on. The moment came later, not in a blaze, but in a sideways breath. Dinner plates had been cleared, desserts half-eaten, wine refilled to loosen tongues. People moved freely now between tables. The photographer drifted like a shadow, catching laughter, stolen glances, the shine of rings. I had just returned to my seat with a cup of coffee when Sophia approached, her maid of honor and another friend in tow. They were speaking Spanish, quickly, comfortably, the way people do when they're sure no one around them is truly listening. I didn't move. I didn't announce myself. I simply sat. Hands folded, eyes lowered to my cup, while their words came clear and bright. "Está cansada," the friend said, glancing at me. "She's tired." "Es dulce," the maid of honor added. "Me recuerda a mi tía, la que siempre está sola." "She's sweet. She reminds me of my aunt, who's always alone." Sophia laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "Es que es muy dramática," she said. "David siempre ha tenido esa parte, needy, insecure, y ella lo hace peor. Siempre con la carita de sacrificio. A veces pienso que si no fuera por mí, él seguiría siendo ese niño patético que llora por todo." She said it lightly, almost affectionately. Pathetic. The word fell between them like something familiar. The other women giggled, exchanging looks that stung more for their casualness than their malice. "Bueno," her friend replied. "Lo arreglaste bien." "You fixed him well." I felt it then. Not shock, not even hurt, but a clarity so sudden it was almost gentle. It wasn't only about me anymore. It was about my son, about the way she saw him, about the future she was building with him as some project redeemed from weakness. There are insults you can ignore when they're thrown at you. There are none you can forgive when they are flung so carelessly at the child you once held through fevers and failures and nights of doubt. I set my cup down slowly, the ceramic touching the tablecloth with barely a sound. I stood, smoothed my dress, adjusted the shawl on my shoulders, and turned to face them. Sophia saw me first. For a fraction of a second, something like surprise crossed her face. Then it vanished beneath that flawless composure. "Mary," she began in English, "are you enjoying yourself?" Her voice rose just enough for those nearby to hear. I smiled, Not the apologetic one she was used to, but something steadier. When I spoke, my voice carried easily across the space, clear enough that the tables closest to us fell silent. No te preocupes, Sophia, I said, in perfect, unhurried Spanish. No estoy cansada. Solo estaba escuchando cómo llamas patético a mi hijo, usando el idioma de mi madre como si fuera tuyo para jugar con él. Don't worry, Sophia. I'm not tired. I was just listening to how you call my son pathetic, using my mother's language as if it were yours to play with. Her cheeks drained of color, a slow, visible retreat. The maid of honor's mouth fell open. Her friend stared between us, eyes wide. Around us, people stilled, their conversations breaking like waves pulling back from shore. Sophia tried to laugh. I think there's a misunderstanding, she said, still in English, but her voice was thinner now. I didn't let her hide there. I stayed in Spanish, my words measured, my tone calm. No hay ningún malentendido. Te he entendido desde la primera cena, desde el primer susurro. Entiendo cada palabra que creíste que volaba por encima de mi cabeza. Lo que quizás no entiendes tú es que una mujer que ha sobrevivido tanto como yo no se confunde con facilidad. There is no misunderstanding. I have understood you since the first dinner, since the first whisper. I understand every word you thought flew over my head. What you don't seem to understand is that a woman who has survived as much as I have does not get confused so easily. The music continued softly in the background, absurd against the sudden quiet. David appeared at my side, his face caught between confusion and dawning horror. Mom, what's going on? He asked, his voice low. I turned to him, and for the first time in a long while, spoke to my son in the language that was our first bridge. Te llaman patético cuando no estás escuchando, I told him. No por amor, sino por desprecio. Y lo hacen confiando en que yo no entenderé, como si yo fuera un mueble viejo en la esquina de tu vida. They call you pathetic when you're not listening, not out of love, but out of contempt, and they do it trusting that I won't understand, as if I am an old piece of furniture in the corner of your life. His eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with something more terrifying to a man like him. Clarity. He looked at Sophia. Is that true? He asked in English now, because truth, apparently, frightened him in any tongue. Sophia straightened, that last defense of proud people when they feel the ground tilt. I was joking, she said. You know how I talk. You're overreacting, she added, switching her gaze back to me. This is really inappropriate, Mary. This is my wedding. I tilted my head slightly, feeling years of swallowed words line up behind my teeth. And this is my son, I said, still calm, still in Spanish. Y no voy a quedarme sentada mientras convierte su vulnerabilidad en chiste y mi lengua en disfraz. And I am not going to sit quietly while you turn his vulnerability into a joke and my language into a costume. A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Her father stood halfway, as if to intervene, but stopped, uncertain which side was safer. The planner hovered near the door, eyes wide, sensing that this was not a moment she could smooth over with timing adjustments. David's hands were shaking. Sophia, did you say that? He asked again, voice cracking. Did you call me pathetic? She rolled her eyes then, a fatal miscalculation. Oh my God, Are we really doing this? It was a figure of speech. You're sensitive, you know that. I always help you toughen up. Your mom is twisting things. And there it was. The pivot, the gaslight, the practiced reversal that had probably worked on him 100 times. But this time, it landed wrong. Because this time, he had heard the words laid out clean, anchored in a language older than her performance. I watched his expression change, watched something behind his eyes rearrange into a shape I recognized from when he was small, and realized someone had lied to him. "It's not a misunderstanding," he said quietly. "You've said things like that before." I could have stopped then. I could have softened, excused, retreated to keep the peace. That is what is expected of women my age. Absorb, forgive, disappear. But this was the moment everything in me had been walking toward, and I knew instinctively that stepping back now would be a final erasure I would never return from. So I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of my shawl settle like armor. "No te preocupes, Sofía," I said once more, softer now and in front of them all. "No voy a arruinar tu boda. Solo quería que supieras que te veía, que te escuchaba, y que por una vez en tu vida, alguien te contestó en un idioma que no podías usar como arma sin consecuencias. Don't worry, Sofía. I'm not going to ruin your wedding. I just wanted you to know that I see you, that I hear you, and that for once in your life, someone answered you in a language you cannot use as a weapon without consequence." Then I turned to my son, switched to English, so he could never say he hadn't understood. "I love you, David. That has never changed. But love doesn't mean I will stand next to a woman who despises the softness I raised you to have. If you choose her with open eyes now, not blind." That's all I needed to do. His lips parted, but whatever words he was reaching for didn't arrive. Around us, the room held its breath. I picked up my clutch, adjusted the shawl over my shoulders, and walked away from the table, from the music, from the beautiful glass cage of their evening. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The doors opened onto the cool night, and as they closed behind me, the sound of the reception muffled into something distant and insignificant. The action itself was simple. I left. The meaning was not. I had answered, fully, irrevocably, in the tongue they thought I'd lost, and in the voice I had finally chosen to keep. The night air outside the venue was thick with salt from the water, a faint wind brushing past, as if the world itself exhaled after what had just happened. I walked without looking back, the sound of my heels steady against the pavement, each step separating me from the noise and perfume of that hall where truth had finally slipped through the seams of all that perfection. The sky was heavy with clouds that never opened, the kind that threaten rain but hold it just long enough to keep you alert. I didn't feel triumphant or broken. I felt hollow in the precise way an old bell feels after it's been rung. Emptied, resonant, alive again through the ache. The streetlights flickered above me, soft and forgiving. And somewhere between the hum of passing cars and the distant laughter of guests, still pretending nothing had happened, I understood that something in me had completed its long, slow transformation. I called a cab, but when it stopped, I waved it on. My body needed the walk, the long unwinding of years spent coiled in restraint. I followed the curve of the waterfront, the hem of my dress brushing against the damp boards of the pier. The shawl slipped from my shoulder, and I caught it just before it fell. My mother's embroidery glimmered faintly in the dim light, the golden thread catching what little brightness remained. She had stitched it decades ago, each pattern a phrase of love disguised as art. I remembered her telling me once that a woman's strength should always have beauty somewhere inside it, even when no one is watching. I thought of her then, of how she would have smiled at what I'd done. Maybe not with approval, but with recognition. She too had known what it was to be underestimated by people who thought quietness meant ignorance. When I reached home, the apartment felt warmer than usual. The air still scented with the faint sweetness of the bread I had baked that morning. I slipped off my shoes and sat by the window, the city glowing beneath me like a constellation of small mercies. I poured myself a glass of wine and waited for the trembling to start. But it didn't. Instead, there was stillness, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, and the sea, for all its chaos, remembers how to breathe. I placed the shawl on the back of the chair, folded with care, and took out my notebook. The last page I had written ended with a promise. The next time, I won't stay silent. I touched the line with my fingertips and smiled without meaning to. I hadn't stayed silent. I had answered in my mother's tongue, in my own time, and it had been enough. It was past midnight when the phone rang. For a moment, I thought of not answering, of letting the world sit outside my door for one night longer. But the number was familiar, and curiosity, that small, stubborn ember, won out. "Mom?" came his voice, rough, unsteady, still echoing with the confusion of the evening. I didn't speak. He hesitated, then said, "I didn't know you understood everything. All this time?" His words trailed into the space between apology and disbelief. "There are many things I understand, David," I said finally, more than I ever wanted to. I heard a sound on his end, movement, maybe the scrape of a chair, maybe him pacing. "She's gone," he said after a pause. "She left with her parents. There was a scene. Everyone's talking. I don't know what to do." I wanted to tell him that doing nothing might be the best start, but instead I said, "Come home, not to stay, just to rest." He arrived an hour later, his suit jacket damp from the mist, his tie loosened, eyes red from something deeper than embarrassment. I didn't ask questions. I made tea. He sat at the table, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "She said I embarrassed her," he whispered. "That you ruined everything. But when you spoke, Mom, I realized I hadn't heard your voice like that in years." I sat across from him, the steam from the cups rising between us like an invisible bridge. "Sometimes we forget what our own mothers sound like," I said. "And then life reminds us." He looked up, meeting my gaze fully for the first time in months. "You were right about her," he said quietly. "You were right about me, too." I shook my head. "No, I was just patient. You had to hear it yourself." We talked until dawn, not about the wedding, not about her, but about smaller things. His childhood, the day he learned to ride a bike, the time he burned a hole in the curtains and swore the cat had done it. I laughed for real then. Not the polite kind, but the deep laugh that shakes something loose inside. When the first light began to spill through the window, he stood and said, "I don't know what happens next." I told him that uncertainty was the most honest beginning there is. Before he left, he paused at the door. "Teach me again," he said. "The language. I've forgotten so much." My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "We'll start with one word," I said. "Amar." It means love. The kind that doesn't need translation. He nodded. the faintest smile breaking through his exhaustion, and then he was gone. After he left, the apartment was quiet again, but not empty. The silence felt companionable, like an old friend who no longer demands conversation. I walked to the balcony, the city bathed in morning gold, and watched people beginning their day. The baker rolling up the shutters downstairs, a woman walking her dog, a boy with a backpack too big for his shoulders. The world continued, indifferent and merciful. I thought of all the women like me, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, who sit quietly through dinners where their worth is measured in silence, who swallow humiliation to keep peace, who mistake endurance for duty. I wanted to tell them that the voice they hide will wait for them, patient and whole, ready to return the moment they decide they deserve to speak. I didn't need an audience anymore. I only needed to know I had answered. That afternoon, I opened my notebook again and wrote a new entry. The handwriting wavered a little from fatigue, but the words came easily. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing what to remember without letting it rot inside you. I remember that I spoke, and that was enough. Then I closed the notebook, set it beside the shawl, and made myself a cup of coffee. The bitterness tasted clean, like truth. Outside, the bells from the nearby church began to ring, slow, resonant, each note lingering long after it should have faded. I listened, feeling their echo in my chest, and understood that I didn't need to go back to that hall or to that life to reclaim anything. Everything I had lost was already returning in its truer form. My voice, my dignity, my peace. Sometimes I still imagine her face when I spoke, the way the mask slipped just long enough for her to realize that her world was smaller than she'd believed. But even that memory has softened with time. I don't hate her. She was just the lesson I needed to finish learning. The lesson that silence is not grace and humility is not servitude. That evening by the water, when I walked away, I didn't just leave a wedding. I left an entire history of apologizing for existing too loudly. Now, when I pass that same waterfront, I sometimes stop to watch the light scatter on the waves, endless and untranslatable. I whisper a word into the wind, one that holds both an ending and a beginning. Gracias. Because every rebirth, even one that comes at 72, begins with gratitude for the courage to finally speak in your own voice.